I'll devote the majority of my presentation to this topic of the state of globalization during the COVID-19 pandemic before sharing some of our key lessons learned from 10 years of research on the DHL Global Connectedness Index. Let's start with this overall trend line on the world's level of global connectedness. This is where we stood in 2019 before COVID struck. And here is where we ended up in 2020. Contrary to predictions that the pandemic might spell the end of globalization, the index just declined modestly last year. And here's our projection range for 2021. The data we have thus far point to globalization rising again this year. So globalization has proven far more resilient than many expected through the COVID-19 pandemic. To explain how we got to that conclusion, let's look at what the index is measuring and how specific types of international flows have developed during the pandemic. The DHL Global Connectedness Index measures globalization based on international trade, capital, information, and people flows, a broad variety of flows within each of these four categories. And this index uniquely measures both the size and the geographic reach of international flows. We'll focus first on trends in the size of international flows across each of the four categories, and then we'll turn to shifts in their geography with a particular focus on this question of whether there's been a shift from global trade to regional trade. So let's dive right in with the trade data, and I'll cover trade in a bit more detail than I cover the other types of flows. International trade in goods shrunk faster at the beginning of the pandemic than it did during the Great Depression, during the global financial crisis. But after plummeting for just 3 months in the first half of 2020, international trade in goods roared back to all the way above its pre-pandemic level before the end of 2020. By early 2021, trade in goods was setting new records at 5% above its pre-pandemic level. Now, I think that's pretty remarkable, considering all of the unique pandemic-driven challenges that we've seen in the trade environment, everything from sudden port and plant closures to capacity constraints and protectionism, that even against that backdrop, that more goods have actually been delivered across national borders this year than ever before. So trade has played a key role in providing essential goods for the response to the pandemic. And it's also been a key enabler of the shifts that we've seen in spending patterns during the pandemic. In the US, for example, people have been buying about 15% more physical goods this year than they did in 2019. And of course, less services. This big shift from consumption of services to physical goods would have been impossible without such a robust recovery of international trade. Now, another aspect of the trade recovery that I think is particularly remarkable is how trade came back so strongly even as there were large changes in the mix of goods that were being traded between countries. The mix of goods traded changed as much in 2020 alone as it normally does over a 5-year period. Trade in everything related to fighting the pandemic, as well as for staying in touch remotely, of course, soared, while trade in many other types of products declined last year. Now, one important caveat to this overall positive story about trade is the fact that the world's poorest countries have been lagging behind in this trade recovery. From 2019 through to the first half of 2021, the trade flows of the world's poorest countries shrunk, while trade grew strongly for countries at the middle and the top of the global income distribution. In the final section of our report this year, we highlight a policy proposal that could help to boost the trade of the world's least developed countries. But coming back to the global level and to the positive news on trade, international trade is forecasted to grow faster than GDP in both 2021 and 2022. So trade is on track to make a positive contribution to global connectedness moving forward. Shifting from trade to capital flows, international investment also plummeted at the beginning of the pandemic, but it's also recovered strongly. Foreign direct investment, which reflects companies buying, building, or reinvesting in operations abroad, fell 35% last year. But it started to come back strong in the first half of this year, and foreign direct investment is actually on track for a full recovery by the end of the year. The other type of capital flow that we measure on the index, portfolio equity flows, also fell sharply at the beginning of the crisis, but has also come back strongly. Now, turning to information flows, the picture is a little bit more complicated. The data that I've put up here show the annual growth rate of international internet traffic. As in-person interactions went online, the growth rate of international internet traffic soared last year, roughly doubling versus its pre-pandemic trend. But what we've actually been tracking over several years is a slowdown in the globalization of information flows. And in 2021, this growth rate of international internet traffic came back down to a little bit below its pre-pandemic level. And this pattern of a slowdown in the globalization of information flows also shows up when we look at data on international voice calls, including calls over the internet, international scientific collaboration, as well as the payments that companies make for the use of intellectual property from abroad. And there's particularly high level of uncertainty around where this part of the index is going to go in the face of cybersecurity threats, as well as very different approaches to regulating data flows in different parts of the world. So this part of the index, I think, will be particularly interesting to watch moving forward. Then people flows. Here, of course, we have seen an unprecedented collapse. The number of people traveling to foreign countries fell 73% last year, rolling back 3 decades of the growth of international travel. And international travel was down 80% over the first 7 months of this year. Now, before the latest news came in on the new variant, I was getting quite optimistic about the travel recovery. We were tracking international travel starting to come back in the middle of the year, a whole wave of countries reopening their borders. Of course, we've faced another setback. We don't know how serious that's going to be. But even before the latest news, the forecast didn't call for a full recovery of international travel until 2023 or 2024. So the people flows are going to take longer to come back. It's also interesting to note that the pandemic slowed but did not reverse the growth of international migration. The number of people living outside of the countries where they were born increased even in 2020, but at a slower rate than was expected before the pandemic. And unsurprisingly, the pandemic appears to have reduced the number of people studying at universities abroad. So when we put our 4 categories of flows together and look at the size trend, the reason why we see no big retreat from global flows is that trade and capital flows have rebounded very strongly, information flows surged to help us stay connected online, and only people flows have suffered a sustained collapse. So what then about the possibility of shifts in the geography of international flows? Here we'll talk about both whether trade is shifting from a global to a regional pattern, as well as the possibility of decoupling between the US and China. So is globalization giving way to regionalization? The pandemic caused a spike in business interest in producing goods closer to a company's end consumers. On one survey conducted in April 2020, 83% of executives said that their companies were planning on nearshoring to make their production networks more regional. But that was a bit of a panicked reaction at the beginning of the pandemic. When the same survey was repeated a year later, just 23% of companies still said that they were planning on nearshoring. But nonetheless, regionalization was a big topic even before the pandemic because geopolitical tensions could potentially lead to more regionalized trade patterns. And so might technologies that could potentially make it more efficient to produce goods closer to a company's customers. So what do the data say? We actually don't find compelling evidence of a shift from global to regional trade. Here's the percent of trade happening within 7 regions defined by the WTO. If we divide the world into these 7 regions, we do find an increase in the regional share of trade, the percent of trade happening within the regions, between 2012 and 2016. But that growth trend ended in 2016, and it's been basically flat since then. Even more interestingly, if we divide the world up into regions in different ways, even that growth trend disappears entirely. Take a look. If you divide the world into just 3 very big regions, the Americas, EMEA, and Asia Pacific, you get that trend. If you divide the world into just the 6 continents, here's the trend. And here's the percent of trade happening within 22 smaller regions. So none of these show you an increase in the percent of trade happening within regions. And the differences between these results also highlight the fact that the intra-regional percent of trade depends very, very much on where you choose to draw the region boundaries. So to overcome that problem, what we do is we calculate the average distance traversed by all trade flows around the world. And what we see is that trade has been stretching out over longer distances over time rather than shorter distances, albeit at a slower rate in recent years. Trade happening over longer rather than shorter distances is, of course, the opposite of what you would expect during a regionalization wave, because regional trade normally happens over shorter distances. And interestingly, this average distance across which countries have been trading even went up during the pandemic. So we conclude that there's no robust evidence of rising regionalization, and we note that the average distance across which countries have been trading went up even during the pandemic. So what then about the possibility of decoupling between the US and China? The gray line here on this graph represents China's level of coupling with the US, and the yellow line represents how coupled the US is with China. Let me explain them a little bit more precisely. So the gray line is tracking the percent of China's combined trade, capital, information, and people flows that are to or from the US, and the yellow line is tracking the percent of the US's trade, capital, information, and people flows that are with China. So when these lines go up, that means these economies are becoming more coupled, they're interacting more with each other. And when these lines go down, that's evidence of decoupling. We only found evidence of decoupling, both lines going down, from both countries' perspectives in 2019. So at the height of the US-China trade war, we did find some evidence of the US and China moving away from each other. But somewhat surprisingly, a surge of trade between the US and China actually pushed these lines back up in 2020, reversing part of the decoupling that we recorded in 2019. And when we look at a broader variety of decoupling measures, we find that the extent, regardless of how we look at it, the extent of US-China decoupling is still quite modest, and that actually the US and China are still connected by what is by far the largest set of long-distance flows between any pair of countries around the world. Now, everything I've told you thus far, everything I've shown you thus far, points to the resilience of globalization. In fact, I can make that point a little bit stronger, and I can tell you that the world is still close to a record high level of globalization. But I wouldn't want to leave you with the false impression that the world is anywhere close to fully globalized. In fact, one of the key themes of our research on the DHL Global Connectedness Index over the years has been the limited extent of globalization in absolute terms. Most flows, it turns out, that could happen either within or between countries are actually still domestic, not international. For example, looking at exports. Of all of the economic output that's generated around the world, just 19% ended up in a different country from where it was produced last year. Investment. All of the foreign direct investment that happened last year, it summed to just 5% of all of the fixed investment that happened around the world. 7% of voice calls were international, and less than 4% of people lived outside of the countries where they were born. When you look at globalization in this way, it highlights the fact that there's actually still quite a lot of headroom to continue growing global flows moving forward. And some of the research in our special report on the 10th anniversary of the DHL Global Connectedness Index suggests that countries actually have quite a lot that they could gain from continuing to connect more with other countries. This is just a simple plot of the relationship between countries' income levels and their scores on the DHL Global Connectedness Index. There's a strong positive relationship between global connectedness and prosperity. All of the world's wealthiest countries are among the most active in international flows, and the world's poorest countries are all among the most disconnected from international activity. So, given that, if policymakers want to boost their country's connectedness with the rest of the world, what could they do? Our special report highlights 5 key policy areas for boosting global connectedness. They are, first, peace and security. Peace and security shows up as a key foundation for positive connections with the rest of the world. Danger is a powerful disconnector, cutting countries off from international opportunities. Second, an attractive domestic business environment can actually boost global flows even more than traditional pro-globalization policies. So the road to more connectedness should usually begin at home. Third, policies directly targeting openness to international flows can also be very effective. And what's interesting about openness policies is that they can be targeted to specific types of international trade, capital, information, and people flows. Regional integration is also a powerful enabler of global connectedness because about half of all of the international flows around the world happen within major world regions. And finally, building societal support for global connectedness should also be a priority to sustain the benefits of a connected world. With that, I will wrap up. To summarize, globalization has proven far more resilient than many expected. Trade has recovered strongly to above its pre-pandemic level. Foreign direct investment is on track for a full recovery this year. We see no evidence of the tide having turned from globalization to regionalization, at least not yet. And we continue to see strong positive relationships between global connectedness and prosperity, as well as a wide variety of policy levers that countries can employ to connect more with the rest of the world. Thank you very much.